Hello, everyone. Welcome to the New York Public Library. Please set your phasers to stun. Silence your phones. My name is Salvatore Scibona, director of the Dorothy and Louis B. Cullman Center for Scholars and Writers, which is above us on the second floor of the library. As many of you know, the Cullman Center, now in its 26th year, selects 15 fellows annually for a 9-month term here at the library, where they receive a private office, deep access to our collections, and a stipend so they can focus exclusively on their work while they're here. The fellows are some of the best and most promising academics, independent scholars, poets, dramatists, artists, and fiction writers at work today. They come here from around the country and the world to use the unparalleled collections housed at this library to write the books of tomorrow. If you or anyone you know would like to apply, you have 3.5 days left. Friday at 5 o'clock is our annual deadline. You can apply through our website. When fellows' books are published, we hold public conversations with their authors. We invite you to these events, which are free and open to the public. You'll see this season's events in the flyers on your chairs, including our October 15th program on Amalgam, the new work of artist and illustrator Frances Jetter about her family's involvement in the 20th century labor movement, and our November 19th conversation between Gene Strauss and Hernan Diaz on Strauss's long-awaited third book, Family Romance, about the dramas, mysteries, intrigues, and tragedies surrounding John Singer Sargent's portraits of the Wertheim family. Strauss, while not a fellow, directed the Cullman Center for more than half of its existence, so we're making her an honorary alumna for the occasion. This event is being recorded and will later be posted on the library's YouTube channel, so you know. A separate light, aside from our conversations from the Cullman Center, is this series. Every 2 years, we present 2 lectures, the Joanna Jackson Goldman Memorial Lectures on American Civilization and Government. The 2024 series begins tonight and concludes tomorrow, again at 6 p.m. here in the Celeste Auditorium. This series has a special provenance. In the spring of 1980, the writer and historian Eric F. Goldman suffered a stroke. His wife, Joanna, undertook the heavy work of caring for him in his illness. Under the strain of the effort, she died suddenly. She was only in her 50s. Eric Goldman recovered, and for the remaining 9 years of his life tried to come up with a fitting way to memorialize her. He never managed to do this, but in the end, he asked his former student, Professor Dan Kevles, who's here with us tonight, and who knew Joanna well, to find a way of celebrating her life and character with the help of the estate he would leave behind. Kevles has remembered Joanna as a courageous, iconoclastic, and compelling person with a radiant inner strength. She loved a conversation of competing ideas, and she loved the United States of America, lumps and all. She believed, in Professor Kevles's words, that its deficiencies could be rectified if only people would stop and think. He and Alan Porter, the executor of the estate, worked to create this endowed series of lectures to honor that belief. We thank both Kevles and Porter for their effort. When Dan and I first discussed this series, he expressed his hope that we would maintain the spirit of Joanna Jackson Goldman in welcoming lectures capable of contrarian ideas. In this spirit, tonight's presenter, Jon Meacham, biographer of presidents both Republican and Democratic from the 19th century and from our own time, surely fits the bill if contrarian can also mean someone able to see a complex history from many often contradictory angles. A Pulitzer Prize-winning biographer and the Rogers Chair in the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University, he's written best-selling books on Abraham Lincoln, John Lewis, George H.W. Bush, Thomas Jefferson, and Andrew Jackson, among others. He will speak tonight and tomorrow in 2 parts on the subject Perilous Fight, Civic Patriotism in a Season of Ethnic Nationalism. Tonight's lectures will go for about 35 to 40 minutes, then we'll move on to your questions. If you'd like to pose a question, please write it on the index card you will have received by now. Staff members will walk along the outside aisles during the lecture to collect your questions in about 30 minutes. We'll try to get to as many of them as we can in our limited time. Copies of some of Jon Meacham's most recent books are for sale in the hall, and he's generously agreed to sign your copy after the lecture. Please help me welcome Jon Meacham.
You went away. Thank you, Salvatore. Appreciate it. I was standing there and I was thinking, yeah, I guess I am all those things. And was sort of thinking maybe he's underselling me. And my mind went back to a moment, it's been about 12 years ago now. I was on the Mall in Washington at the National Book Festival. And I was on my way at that point to give my talk about Andrew Jackson. And a woman ran up to me, which doesn't happen enough, or ever, actually. And she said, "Oh my God, it's you." And I said, "Well, yes, existentially speaking, that's hard to argue with." And I live in Tennessee, so I have to leave the state to use existential as an adverb. So thank you all. Don't get cocky. She said, your books have meant so much to me. My family loves them. Will you wait right here? I'm going to go buy your new book and have you sign it. And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And I stood there thinking, this is the way the world is supposed to be. And hand to God, she brought back John Grisham's latest. So whenever I think I'm the most important anything, I remind myself that somewhere in America, there's a woman with a forged copy of The Runaway Jury. I signed it. The second part of that story is also true. At that point, I was writing the book about George Herbert Walker Bush. It took me 17 years. It was supposed to be posthumous, but the son of a bitch wouldn't die. I'd bring it up. He'd say, "Not gonna do it." And I was on my way to Maine to see the Bushes. And for some reason, it was just the three of us at lunch that day, which almost never happened. Bush World was like a WASP Disneyland, right? Gorbachev would be trying to make the Keurig work. The Oak Ridge Boys would be on the putting green. Billy Graham would be playing tennis. All that happened once. But it was just us. And I told this story about being mistaken for Grisham. And I will confess to you, it was an entirely transparent attempt to get either the former president or the former first lady to say, "Oh, you're so much more important than John Grisham," right? So I had cast the fly out on the stream. And Barbara Bush looks across the table and says, "Well, how do you think poor John Grisham would feel? He's a very handsome man." So it was a bad weekend. I am a longtime admirer of Professor Goldman. I'm honored to be here. Professor Goldman was someone who both worked in the academy and brought that work to the public arena in a way that we live in a better country because, in many ways, he activated history. And so I'm honored to be here. I don't usually use a text, but here we go. Salvatore made me. Here we go. The news was grim. In a majority opinion delivered from the bench of the United States Supreme Court on Friday, March 6, 1857, Chief Justice Roger Taney ruled in the case of Dred Scott, an enslaved man suing for his liberty after being taken from the slave state of Missouri into free federal territory. One lower court had agreed with Scott. Another, the state Supreme Court of Missouri, had ruled against him, and the case had come to Washington in 1856. 5 of the justices of the U.S. Supreme Court, including Taney of Maryland, were from slave states, and they now joined with 2 others to issue a sweeping decision on this late winter Friday. The opinion was unambiguous. The court ruled that Scott could not prevail in his bid for freedom, for Scott had no standing in the American order other than the fact of his enslavement. Black people, the Chief Justice announced, were not protected by the Declaration of Independence's assertion of human equality. Free or enslaved, black people could not be considered citizens. And the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery in northern regions of the Louisiana Purchase, was held to be unconstitutional. Black people, the court wrote, had long been considered subhuman, and so they should remain. It was a breathtakingly pro-slavery ruling. Reading the news in Rochester, New York, where he had settled after escaping enslavement in Taney's, Maryland, Frederick Douglass reacted not gloomily, but defiantly. Douglass said this, Come what will, I hold it to be morally certain that sooner or later, by fair means or foul means, in quiet or in tumult, in peace or in blood, in judgment or in mercy, God, he wrote well. Couldn't write a bad sentence. Slavery is doomed to cease out of this otherwise goodly land, and liberty is destined to become the settled law of this republic. I base my sense of the certain overthrow of slavery in part upon the nature of the American government, the Constitution, the tendencies of the age, and the character of the American people. And this, notwithstanding the important decision of Judge Taney, I know of no soil better adapted to the growth of reform than American soil. I know of no country where the conditions for effecting great changes in the settled order of things, for the development of right ideas of liberty and humanity, are more favorable than here in these United States. Note Douglas's terms, this otherwise goodly land, right ideas of liberty and humanity, the nature of the American government, the character of the American people. Douglas was deploying the language of what we're going to call civic patriotism, the love of and loyalty to a country that seeks to hold the individual to be sacred and equal before the law. In that country, the country of which Frederick Douglass spoke, identity is not derived from color or birth or a particular religious creed, but from an adherence to a set of ideals that apply not just to a favored few. Put in philosophical terms, Douglas's reaction to the Taney decision was the reaction of a patriot who believed in the principles of the country even in the face of a brutal move toward ensuring that the United States would be a country based not on ideals, but on ethnic nationalism. In this case, a nationalism of white supremacy. Patriotism could reform America. Ethnic nationalism embodied its worst features. The tensions of that cataclysmic antebellum, though we weren't sure the bellum was coming, of that hour were extreme. As Lincoln would note, it was because of slavery that the war came. But those tensions are not exceptional. America has always been defined, and is even now, by the struggle between the appetites of the few and of the privileged against the aspirations and ambitions of the many, who have rightly insisted that the nation live up to its self-professed creed of sacred rights and equal justice under law. Self-professed. Our history shows us that this struggle is not the work of a day. It is rather the animating force of generations. The story of how fully or how meagerly America recognizes and acts upon the implications of the Declaration of Independence and of the Constitution, which Frederick Douglass called a glorious liberty document, is the story of the country. And that story is in no way a fairy tale. It's not an uncomplicated saga of inevitable progress, for progress, as we know, is anything but inevitable. Nor is it an entirely uplifting drama of good prevailing over evil. In my view, we do ourselves no favors by pretending that American history is either cheerfully grand or unrelievedly bleak. In my view, our history is sometimes grand, sometimes bleak, and always interesting. And why wouldn't it be? It is a human undertaking, and as subject to selfishness and to greed, to cruelty and injustice as we are in our own lives. Nativism, xenophobia, cultural populism, political fear, and ethnic nationalism have shaped the republic from the beginning and likely always will. That is the nature of life in a fallen, frail, and fallible world. Anxiety and its manifestations in the public square ebb and flow. And truth be told, they mostly flow. The American founders understood this. If men were angels, Madison wrote, then no government would be necessary. And given that men are so self-evidently unangelic, the American government was designed to check our passions and balance our failings. And the issue for our own unangelic moment The issue that requires the attention of the citizen and the work of the politician is straightforward. Not simple, but straightforward. Is the United States of America, in the middle of the third decade of the 21st century, a sustainable enterprise and constitutional government grounded in principles of equality, dignity, and fair play, or is it not? This is not a hyperbolic question. I wish it were. Will a sufficient number of us choose a patriotic politics of constitutional consensus over and against a politics of ethnic nationalism? Let's define our terms. I'm going to do so broadly, too broadly, doubtless, for many political scientists and political philosophers. But for our time together, broadness is a necessity, and the complications and permutations of the intellectual debate over patriotism and nationalism, both in the United States and abroad, is accessible to those who wish to seek it out. My aim is specific: to suggest a mode of thinking about the conflicts of our time in a historically and philosophically informed way in order to make the stakes of the prevailing contest in American politics as clear as possible. A personal word. I am a biographer and a Christian. I'm not very good at either. Robert Louis Stevenson once said, "The duty of the Christian is not to succeed, but to fail cheerfully," by which I am a cheerful Christian. And I'm an Episcopalian, so we barely count. But I do tend to think historically and theologically. From the first Passover to the Last Supper, remembrance lies at the heart of the monotheistic tradition into which I was born and which I observe. In his final song to the people of Israel, Moses said, "Remember the days of old, remember the years of many generations. Ask thy fathers, and they will tell thee, thy elders, and they will show thee." The central sacramental commandment of Christianity is to do this in remembrance of me. Remembrance in this sense is not remembrance for the sake of sentimentality and least of all for nostalgia, but remembrance as an act of witness and an act of agency. To remember stories of deliverance, stories of mercy, stories of sacrificial love, is to call to mind and to heart acts that are worthy not only of commemoration, but of emulation. And the act of remembering the past can help us assess the perils and possibilities of a given course of action. Plutarch, and you knew he was coming, put the matter this way: history is a certain rule and instruction which by examples past teach us to judge of things present and to foresee things to come, so we may know what to like and what to follow, what to mislike and what to eschew. Which brings us to our own hour upon the stage. What should we like and follow? And what should we mislike and eschew? I think we should like and follow civic patriotism and mislike and eschew ethnic nationalism. By civic patriotism, I mean the allegiance of a people to a state devoted to principles of human liberty, individual dignity, representative government, and equality before the law. By ethnic nationalism, I mean the impulse of a people to extend rights and to protect and pursue the interests only of a particular group whose members share, for instance, a place of birth, language, religious affiliation, or characteristics associated with racial categories and hierarchies. For our purposes, civic patriotism emphasizes possibility and pluralism. Ethnic nationalism values stasis and homogeneity. Civic patriotism tends to be inclusive. Ethnic nationalism is largely exclusive. Civic patriotism grows out of, and rightly practiced, is supportive of the democratic tradition embodied in the Declaration and in the Constitution. Ethnic nationalism has more in common with autocratic movements that seek to supplant the liberal ethos of the rule of the many with the rule of the one, be it one man or one group. There is a large and compelling literature on patriotism, nationalism, and their similarities and dissimilarities. The concepts are closely linked. Adherents of patriotism as we define it here can hold nationalist views and vice versa. And as ever, if you do what I do for a living, there are two people who have thought of anything one might think of and said it better. and that is George Orwell and Richard Hofstadter. So here is George Orwell. Writing in 1945, Orwell wrote this: "By nationalism, I mean the habit of assuming that human beings can be classified like insects, and that whole blocks of millions or tens of millions of people can be confidently labeled good or bad. But secondly, and this is much more important, I mean the habit of identifying oneself with a single nation or other unit, placing it beyond good and evil, and recognizing no other duty than that of advancing its interests. Nationalism," Orwell went on, "is not to be confused with patriotism. Both words are normally used in so vague a way that any definition is liable to be challenged, but one must draw a distinction between them, since two different and even opposing ideas are involved. By patriotism, I mean devotion to a particular place and a particular way of life, which one believes to be the best in the world, but has no wish to force on other people. Patriotism is of its nature defensive, both militarily and culturally. Nationalism, on the other hand, is inseparable from the desire for power." So wrote George Orwell. Half a century later, the scholar Maurizio Veroli wrote in terms similar to Orwell's. The language of patriotism has been used over the centuries to strengthen or invoke love of the political institutions and the way of life that sustain the common liberty of a people, that is, love of the republic. The language of nationalism was forged in the late 18th century Europe to defend or reinforce the cultural, linguistic, and ethnic oneness and homogeneity of a people. So wrote Maurizio Veroli. I stipulate again that there are scholars and writers who will find these definitions of civic patriotism and ethnic nationalism overly simplistic, even problematic. George Kateb at Princeton, for instance, believes patriotism is a mistake. Other writers see little utility in attempting to distinguish between patriotism and nationalism. Jürgen Habermas, his explorations of constitutional patriotism bear much consideration, and a young Roman Catholic intellectual, Robert Christian, has written well on the topics under discussion. I have learned much from them all. Such arguments are fascinating and important, and I make no claim here to be offering anything that begins to pretend to be philosophically novel. My purpose is to introduce a frame of reference that is not often deployed in the broad public arena in order to draw on the vernacular of political philosophy and history to cast light on the issues of our time in potentially clarifying ways. For this is a moment in which ethnic nationalism is a powerful force in our politics. Polling after the 2016 election found the following. Nearly two-thirds, 65%, of white working-class Americans believe American culture and way of life has deteriorated since the 1950s. Nearly half, 48%, of white working-class Americans say, quote, "Things have changed so much that I often feel like a stranger in my own country." Nearly 7 in 10, 68%, of white working-class Americans believe the American way of life needs to be protected from foreign influence. Nearly 7 in 10, 68%, of white working-class Americans, along with a majority, 55% of the public overall, believe the United States is in danger of losing its culture and identity. Amid such sensibilities, ethnic nationalism offers an appealing refuge. It's therefore incumbent on those of us who believe in the capacity of the American Union in its public and private spheres to create conditions for lives of prosperity and of purpose and to pursue justice. It's incumbent on us to argue for the virtues of civic patriotism. And I hold that civic patriotism has, for all of its imperfections, for all of its sins and shortcomings, helped create a nation where liberal pluralism has endured and often, at least until now, prevailed. In this America, disagreement is not fatal. Neither is birth determinative. One can become an American by pledging allegiance to the noblest of ideas, the ideas for which Americans fought and bled and died at Lexington and Concord, at Gettysburg, at Normandy, and at Selma, Alabama. Whether the shadows decisively fall over American democracy is, for the moment, an open question. And arriving at what I believe is the proper resolution to that open question means keeping faith with a past that, however troubled, is far better than a future in which the power of a single man and a single movement prevail over the principles of Jefferson and King, of Douglas and of Lincoln. And of a lesser-known figure, Carl Schurz, an immigrant of German birth who became a Union general and after the Civil War, a United States Senator from Missouri. On the floor of the Senate in the winter of 1872, Senator Matthew Carpenter of Wisconsin repeated an aphorism attributed to Stephen Decatur from the War of 1812, "My country, right or wrong." In reply, Schurz said, "The senator from Wisconsin cannot frighten me by exclaiming, 'My country, right or wrong.' In one sense, I say so too. My country, and my country is the great American Republic. My country, right or wrong, if right, to be kept right, and if wrong, to be set right." This question of patriotic loyalty to a polity that one believes is on the wrong track is essential. Like Frederick Douglass, like Carl Schurz, the patriotism of the resistor and the reformer must be defined and defended. For without that patriotic sentiment, the amelioration of the whole will be endlessly and perhaps eternally deferred by declared or undeclared secession from the national project. Remember, William Lloyd Garrison wanted the Union to secede. "No union with slave holders" was the cry. Douglas's cry was "no union with slave holding." I should stipulate that I'm not a universalist on these issues or an adherent of what's sometimes called cosmopolitanism. It's a fact of history that principles require defined geographic and cultural realms in which to prevail. Human nature tells us that nation-states will be with us always, and therefore our focus, I believe, should be on the cultivation of those principles in a discernible polity. On this question, the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre has much to teach us. He delineated patriotism this way: "It is of the essence of the morality of liberalism that no limitations are or can be set upon the criticism of the social status quo. No institution, no practice, no loyalty can be immune from being put in question and perhaps rejected. When the liberal moralist claims that the patriot is bound to treat his or her nation's projects and practices in some measure uncritically, the claim is not only that at any one time certain of these projects and practices will be being treated uncritically, it is that some at least must be permanently exempted from criticism. The patriot is in no position to deny this, but what is crucial to the patriot's case is to clearly define and identify what it is that is being exempted. What then is exempted? The answer is the nation conceived as a project." MacIntyre went on, "When the patriot is committed to a particular way of linking, what the patriot is committed to is a particular way of linking a past which has conferred a distinctive moral and political identity upon him or her with a future for the project which is his or her nation, which it is his or her nation, her responsibility to bring into being. Only this allegiance to the project is unconditional, and allegiance to particular governments or particular leaders will be entirely conditional upon their being devoted to furthering that project rather than frustrating it or destroying it. Hence, there is nothing inconsistent in a patriot's being deeply opposed to his country's contemporary rulers." So wrote Alistair MacIntyre. So let's note well the heart, as I see it, of his argument, that the only truly sacrosanct thing in the swirl of politics is the nation conceived as a project, which means that an understanding of patriotism should be rooted in first principles and those principles' applications. And thanks to Abraham Lincoln, we hold that America is a project conceived in liberty. And so to begin at the beginning of the American tradition, patriotism was widely seen as a virtue. In his 1736 essay on the spirit of patriotism, Henry St. John Bolingbroke, there's a name, I always wanted to be First Lord of the Admiralty. I thought it was a great title. I don't want to do it, but I like the title. A Whig politician whose writings were read by the American founders observed, "The service of our country is a real duty. To what higher station, to what greater glory can any mortal aspire than to be, during the course of his whole life, the support of the good, the control of the bad, and the guardian of public liberty?" The word patriot is coeval with the American Revolution as we popularly understand it. Patriots were those who supported American independence. Tories were those who were loyal to Great Britain. The language came from 18th century British politics, and a key question for us is, what did it mean to be patriotic to the revolutionary cause in this moment of conception for the American project? It's not too sentimental to suggest that the patriots of that time were driven, at least in part, and in addition to sundry other motives, some noble, some decidedly not, by an allegiance to the general, if only partially extended, idea of individual sovereignty under law. To be sure, divisions were real and enduring, but just enough colonists, just enough, came to see that the promise of the Declaration of Rights of the Glorious Revolution was going unfulfilled. As Thomas Paine wrote in Common Sense, in America, the law and no man was king. In elegiac verse, Phyllis Wheatley invoked the image of Columbia for the nation struggling to be born. And in perhaps the most important sentence ever originally rendered in English, Thomas Jefferson asserted that all men were created equal, giving the burgeoning polity a central tenet. I know that can seem a hyperbolic claim, the most important sentence originally rendered in English. It's a little like the story about the Texas school board candidate who was against teaching Spanish in the public schools and said on the campaign trail, "If English was good enough for our Lord Jesus Christ, it's good enough for Texas." So, when George W. was governor, I told him that story. He said, "That's pretty funny, asshole." Anyway, that wasn't in the text. Sorry, Salvador. A dozen years later, after Jefferson's sentence, 1788, with the Constitution newly ratified, the patriot physician Benjamin Rush exclaimed, "'Tis done, we have become a nation." Which raises all kinds of questions. What did Dr. Rush mean by nation? What, for that matter, do we mean when we speak of the nation? The root of the word, of course, is birth, and scholars have charted how the term initially designated groups of foreigners within the Roman Empire, and down the centuries was used to characterize not only groups of common birth origin, but also of like-mindedness, which could bring people of sundry origins into a national fold. And there is a large literature on the rise of nation-states in the late 18th and 19th centuries. But back to Dr. Rush. In context, we can say that by nation, he meant a politically unified sovereign entity in control of its internal affairs and speaking with one voice in foreign affairs. The Constitution he had written John Adams just 2 weeks before, quote, "makes us a nation. It rescues us from anarchy. It revives agriculture and commerce. It checks moral and political iniquity. In a word, it makes a man both willing to live and to die. To live, because it opens to him fair prospects of great public and private happiness. To die, because it ensures peace, order, safety, and prosperity to his children." To live and to die. The American nation, then, was the embodiment of the virtues of liberty and of order. Rush clearly saw moral significance in the formation of the new union, positing that the nation is a mutually beneficial partnership of citizen and ruler, and of citizen and fellow citizen, and is in sum a political entity with territorial definition that depends not only on birth, but on assent to common principles, a question so vital that one should be willing to give one's life for it. And remember, Rush was speaking specifically in the context of the ratification of the Constitution. He saw it as the signal event in the formation of an object of patriotic loyalty. We were not a nation before the Constitution. In Rush's eyes, we were one after. It was and is an imperfect document for an imperfect people, but a document that gave the nation Rush now celebrated and defined the capacity to amend and reform itself, ideally without violence. That, in the beginning, was what the nation was supposed to be. But of course, it wasn't, and we weren't. African slavery existed in Spanish holdings in the New World as early as 1502. It had come to English North America by 1619. Over the 300-odd-year course of the Atlantic slave trade, some 12.5 million black people were enslaved and brought across the ocean. The population of enslaved people in the United States increased fivefold to about 4 million between the Treaty of Paris in 1783 and the inauguration of Abraham Lincoln in 1861. Slavery was an ancient institution. Often, though, slavery had been based on conquest, not on race. For much of recorded history, the enslaved in a society could come from anywhere and look like anyone. By the 16th century, the rush to exploit slavery in the fertile Western Hemisphere proved profit and power to be more compelling than theoretical respect for the sanctity of the individual. Geopolitics also played a key role. Portuguese traders turned to Africa to supply the demand for enslaved labor, partly because Turkish control of the Mediterranean foreclosed access to the Balkans and other parts of Europe. The rise of African slavery, racial prejudice, and the ethnological arguments for black inferiority intersected in the New World with tragic results. The 19th century historian George Bancroft wrote, quote, "The Negro race from the first was regarded with disgust, and its union with the whites forbidden under the worst of penalties." In the age of the American Revolution, the hypocrisy at the heart of the national project did not go unnoticed. Calls for the abolition of slavery in what became the United States date from 1688, when Quakers in Germantown, Pennsylvania, wrote a petition against slavery. The first formal abolition organization, the Society for the Relief of Free Negroes Unlawfully Held in Bondage, was founded at the Sun Tavern in Philadelphia on Friday, April 14th, 1775, just 5 days before the Battle of Lexington and Concord. In Massachusetts, Elizabeth Freeman, an enslaved woman, successfully sued for her liberty on the basis of the state's 1780 constitutional claim that, quote, "all men are born free and equal and have certain natural, essential, and unalienable rights." She saw the implications of the American promise more clearly than many, and she acted on that understanding. She acted, in other words, patriotically. Freeman's suit foreshadowed much. Between 1777 and 1817, 7 states pursued abolition. Slavery was banned in Vermont by its 1777 state constitution, in Massachusetts by a 1783 judicial ruling, in Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New York, and New Jersey by gradual emancipation laws from 1780 to 1808. And New York passed a general emancipation bill that went into effect in 1827. At the federal level, the Confederation Congress approved the Northwest Ordinance in 1787. Upheld 2 years later by the first federal Congress after the ratification of the Constitution, the document provided that there could, quote, "be neither slavery nor involuntary servitude in the territories that would give rise to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Wisconsin, and part of Minnesota. Border and southern states, meanwhile, my part of the world, protected and nurtured slavery. In 1790, during the first Congress, Representative Thomas Tudor Tucker of South Carolina dismissed talk of a general emancipation of slaves by law, saying, "This will never be submitted to by the southern states without a civil war." History would prove Tucker right. An ethnic nationalism of white supremacy was a tragic, durable, undeniable fact of American history. That nationalism was often framed and argued in religious terms as pro-slavery theology took shape in the 19th century, largely after it became ever clearer that anti-slavery sentiment was growing. The traditional story of American self-understanding has much to recommend it. The War of 1812 did feed what we tend to call nationalist feeling, by which we really mean an emphasis on the union of the states as a nation in rather the way Benjamin Rush described it. By 1830, in a debate between Daniel Webster of Massachusetts and Robert Haney of South Carolina over tariff policy, but which everyone understood to be about federal supremacy versus state rights and a precursor to emancipation versus slavery, Webster offered a prose poem to the virtues of union. "When my eyes shall be turned to behold for the last time the sun in heaven, may I not see it shining on the broken and dishonored fragments of a once glorious union, or on a land rent with blood. Let their last feeble and lingering glance rather behold the gorgeous ensign of the Republic, now known and honored throughout the earth, still high full advanced, and spread over all in characters of living light, blazing on all its sample folds, as they float over the sea and over the land." He would not have been good at Twitter. "And in every wind under the whole heavens, that other sentiment, dear to every true American heart, liberty and union, now and forever, one and inseparable." He then sat down at his desk. "Mr. Webster," a colleague said, "I think you had better die now and rest your fame on that speech." Knowing himself defeated, Senator Haney was gracious. "You ought not to die," he said to Webster. "A man who can make speeches like that ought never to die." In his eloquence, Webster had defined civic patriotism: liberty and union, not just nation, but liberty and union. The principle, liberty, and the polity, union, were entwined. Loyalty to one was loyalty to the other. Andrew Jackson, then the President of the United States, was grateful, and he put Senator Webster's oratory into action in late 1832 and early 1833 as the president faced down South Carolina, it's always South Carolina, over nullification. In a draft of his second inaugural, Jackson dedicated himself to the cause of the nation, writing, "I feel in the depths of my soul that it is the highest, most sacred, and most irreversible part of my obligation to preserve the union of these states, although it may cost me my life." And in 1838, a 28-year-old young lawyer named Abraham Lincoln delivered his first major public speech to the Young Men's Lyceum of Springfield, Illinois. He said, "We find ourselves under the government of a system of political institutions conducing more essentially to the ends of civil and religious liberty than any of which the history of former times tells us. At what point, then, is the approach of danger to be expected? I answer, if it ever reach us, it must spring up amongst us. It cannot come from abroad. If destruction be our lot, we must ourselves be its author and finisher. As a nation of freemen, we must live through all time or die by suicide." So let's end for tonight where we began, with Frederick Douglass on the eve of the Civil War contemplating the possibilities and limitations of a country that seemed determined to crush people of color from every angle. In the aftermath of the Dred Scott decision, a time when everything seemed to be conspiring to preserve slavery, to exalt nationalism over patriotism, Douglass insisted that the darkness of the moment could not long endure. A few years before, in an address at Corinthian Hall in Rochester on the 5th of July, black speakers would be invited to speak on the 5th, not the 4th. Douglass had declared a basic faith. He had said, "I do not despair of this country. The fiat of the Almighty, let there be light, has not yet spent its force." Now, with Chief Justice Taney's haunting words in the headlines, Douglass reaffirmed those convictions. He said this: "The Constitution, as well as the Declaration of Independence and the sentiments of the founders of this republic, give us a platform broad enough and strong enough to support the most comprehensive plans for the freedom and elevation of all the people of this country, without regard to color, class, or clime." And as rickety as it may seem, the platform in which Frederick Douglass put such faith remains beneath our feet. It has fallen to us to have to summon the courage to take our stand upon it, come what will, and what is. Thank you. I have never been so disciplined. Y'all would have gotten a lot more stories.
So thank you so much, Jon. I have some questions for you from the audience.
Where are you? You're a voice of
I'm
God
over
right
here.
now. There you are. Hi.
Has it ever been the case in American history that civic patriots have also been ethnic nationalists? How do you reconcile the fact that many statesmen throughout our history have touted democracy while also denying various ethnic groups their rights?
Because we're all sinners, and we screw everything up. This is a technical Cullman Center kind of analysis. I mean it. Do we mess things up more often than we get them right? Yes, I think so. The point is that we continue to seek a more perfect manifestation of those principles. And if you doubt that, if this seems sort of, like a homily you'd hear in an assisted living facility between Murder, She Wrote and, Jeopardy, I'm very big in those audiences. I submit to you the Garrison-Douglas debate. William Lloyd Garrison did not think this was a redeemable nation. In Massachusetts, 4th of July, 1854, he burns a copy of the Constitution. It's one of the great panels of all time, though. This is, besides what the Cullman Center does. Henry David Thoreau, Sojourner Truth, William Lloyd Garrison were all on one panel. That would be a fleece you would keep. So he burned the Constitution and said it's a pact with the devil and an agreement with death. Douglass said, okay, great, very eloquent, but what about the 4 million enslaved folks? What's going to happen to slavery if the South is unilaterally given nationhood? You'll feel virtuous. That's great. I'm sure in Boston, you can be all kinds of gracious, self-satisfied, but it didn't help anyone else. Look, I don't want to be, an Anglican Reinhold Niebuhr too much. This is one of the few rooms in the world where I can make that joke. But I believe it. I believe we are imperfect. I believe that with the fact that my whole view of the United States of America is the fact that we've gotten as much right as we have is a miracle.
Do empires have nationalism and patriotism? Is the U.S. an empire?
Is the U.S. an empire? No, I don't think so. Patriotism is not a reflexive adherence to a thing. It's an adherence to an idea that must shape the nature of the thing. Does that make sense? Is that it's the arena itself can ebb and flow, as we talked about, between light and dark, justice and injustice, kindness and cruelty, grace and rage, like all of us, by the way. Again, y'all are better people than I am, but that's not hard, so don't get cocky. But I know that if I do the right thing 51% of the time, that's a heck of a good day, and I don't have that many of them. So why would a democracy be any different? It's the fullest manifestation of all of us. Democracy is incredibly counterintuitive. It's give and take, but who the hell wants to give? We've been dealing with this since the 3rd chapter of Genesis. There was a piece of fruit, we were told not to take it, we wanted it, we took it.
As a teacher and educator, what would you conclude is the most vital aspect of our history that this next generation should understand and learn from?
Everything I've said. Let me answer with a story. Alex Haley used to say, if you want me to remember anything, just tell him a story. So about 4 years ago, right before COVID, so 5 years ago, I teach at Vanderbilt, and had a student who thought Elizabeth Warren was a little too far to the right. So it gives you some idea, right? She thought Bernie had been co-opted. And let me walk you through this. So I have the point about Jefferson in the most important sentence is that Jefferson was able to write that sentence in June of 1776, not least because he had been in a kind of figurative conversation with the previous 3 or 4 centuries of Western life. Right? And so I'm lecturing on this to the class, and this very bright young woman, but not a candidate for AEI internships by any means. Again, love the room. And I said, so basically what Jefferson was doing was he was kind of channeling a culture that had been shaped by Gutenberg, the invention of movable type, which democratizes information, helps the spread of literacy, the spread of capitalism, the scientific revolution, the European Enlightenment, the Scottish Moral Enlightenment, the Protestant Reformations, the translation of sacred scripture into the vernacular, which created a world that was less vertical, popes, princes, prelates, kings, who were given authority over all of us by either an accident of birth or an incident of election, that was shifting to a more horizontal understanding in which we were born with the capacity to determine our own destinies. And that shift was, I thought, the most important shift in Western life since the Passion of Jesus of Nazareth, which determined how we tell time. And hand goes up from Mrs. Sanders. And she said, no. I said, well, is there anything more specific? She said, I don't believe the Declaration of Independence is an Enlightenment document. It didn't include me, it didn't include Native people, it didn't include... I said, of course, yes. We're all going to go read Frederick Douglass's 1876 Oration in Memory of Abraham Lincoln. And your homework for tonight, if you wish. If you are gluttons for punishment here at this intellectual Guantanamo, and you're coming back, read that speech. It was delivered at the dedication of the Freedmen's Monument on Capitol Hill, the first monument ever entirely paid for, constructed, designed by Black Americans. And it is Frederick Douglass saying, Abraham Lincoln was preeminently the white man's president. You white Americans were his children. We were at best his stepchildren. He adopted us by the force of circumstance and necessity. And yet our liberation met in this man and this moment. And so when we look at this monument, we see both, me talking now, not Douglas, peril. If even the best of us can have been so cold, tardy, and indifferent to emancipation, Douglas's phrase, cold, tardy, and indifferent. He tarried long in the mountain, Douglas said of Lincoln. He tarried long in the mountain. But he tarried, again, Douglas, because of the opinion of the country which he, as a statesman, was bound to consult. And had he tried to move faster, he could not have moved at all. Is that ideal? No. I am not holding this up as a paragon. I'm holding it up as the least bad. Because I believe that that's what history and human nature ultimately, those are the examples we get. And so the question we always have to ask ourselves, and I call it the Garrison question. Oh, and by the way, well, she's now at Yale Law School, of course. But a week later, we came back, and she said, basically, she had turned into a Niebuhr student. I mean, she was like absolutely, it's all about pragmatism and compromise, and you can think one thing, but if you can't get something done. And I thought, my work is done here. Again, not because the heroic stories we tell, and they are heroic, right? We build monuments. Douglas was building a monument. Heroic does not mean perfect, but heroic does mean aspirational. Something can be illuminating and inspirational without being ideal. And if you want an ideal model, you're left with scripture and conscience. You're not really left with a lot of history, I believe. Final point on this. One of the great honors of my life was to write a book about John Robert Lewis. And for people who doubt that the country can change, I refer you to the fact that John Robert Lewis was born on February 21st, 1940, in segregated Troy, Alabama, Pike County. Didn't really see a white person until he was a teenager. Overcame a childhood stutter by preaching to the chickens in his sharecropper family's farmyard. He later said the House Democratic Caucus reminded him, except that the chickens listened. It's a great line from the old man. John Lewis was able to do what he did. He was a New Testament saint, I believe, willing to die for an ideal, a genuine patriot in the sense we've been discussing. He was a civic patriot. He was the embodiment of this. But in the work I did, and he was dying as I was doing it, we all go back, particularly people who look like me, go back to Dr. King's paraphrase of Theodore Parker. The arc of a moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice. That can be sometimes rhetorically a kind of get-out-of-jail-free card for folks who look like me. I'm a boringly heterosexual white Southern male Episcopalian, right? Things work out for me in this country. But the point is that it's supposed to work out for everyone. And the arc of a moral universe does not bend toward justice naturally. It only bends if there are people like John Robert Lewis insisting that it swerve, because every time someone insists that it swerve, someone's over here trying to pull it back. You have a patriot over here, and you have a nationalist over here for our purposes.
We'll ask one more question. If you were asked to write a new chapter of Profiles in Courage for our times, who would you include?
Oh. So President Kennedy once said, there's a reason Profiles in Courage was one volume and short. I think I'm going to give you the obvious answer, ripped from the headlines, but I believe it, and that is Liz Cheney. By the absolute standard, yeah. By the standard that Senator Kennedy set in 1957 when he wrote the book, when he did the book. He was a creature of the Senate. And so those were profiles of senators who were willing to risk re-election, which was, of course, the guiding principle of all political life. I remember about 3 years into Michael Bloomberg's first of 7 terms, whatever it was. Is he still mayor? I remember Bloomberg saying, you know what I've learned about politics, politicians, is politicians are driven by 3 things: the desire to be reelected, the desire to be reelected, and the desire to be reelected. But what Congresswoman Cheney did was sacrifice temporal power for a principle, and brought along her father, I think we can safely say that, and her mother, and everybody in this room, but I would wager a significant number of folks in this room in 2003 and 2004 were less than favorably disposed to the Cheney family. Fair? Yeah. Yeah, that's what I thought. And yet, 2 things happened. I thought Vice President Cheney, and not that this is the reason anyone should do anything, but I'll close with this, but there's an interesting element of this. He changed his New York Times obituary on January 6, 2022. There were 2 Republicans on the floor of the House of Representatives when Nancy Pelosi, the most formidable legislator in American history, when she had a commemoration of the attack on the Capitol. 2, the gentlewoman from Wyoming and the former gentleman from Wyoming. 2 Cheneys. That was it. Nobody else came. And I remember I was up there that day. Doris Goodwin and I were doing something, and this is one of the few rooms that would also appreciate this. A quick story about a very small category called great tweets. It's like French military victories in the 20th century. Won't take long. About 9 months ago, someone tweeted out that if Mr. Rogers and Doris Goodwin had had a one-night stand, I would have resulted. And right, I thought it was great. I thought it was fabulous. Doris was kind of pissed off. So she learned how to use her cell phone, and she called. And she said, couldn't Mr. Rogers, this is a true story, couldn't Mr. Rogers and I have fallen in love and you were the fruit of our long and happy marriage? I said, no, sweetheart, he picked you up in the C-SPAN bar. Anyway, I've totally forgotten what I was talking about. Oh, so Liz Cheney, Dick Cheney, I believe that to be true. And I believe that history will judge those who have been quiet in this moment harshly, and it may not be explicitly harshly for failing to do something, but there are people who are raising their historical stock, and there are people by doing things, and there are people who are lowering their historical stock by not. And one of the things that I think is vital, and one of the reasons I find history and biography to be of a certain moral utility, it goes back to the great story. After John Lewis is beaten on March 7th, 1965, Bloody Sunday, he's still in Selma. And, you know, in the American experience, you know, in sort of the PBS version of this, right, there's the beating on the bridge, and then Johnson speaks and says, we shall overcome. That was 8 days later. It wasn't the next day. It was a Monday, but it was Monday week. What did Johnson do in those 8 days? He wanted to, as ever with Lyndon Johnson, be in control. So he did two things. He forced Dr. King to go through the courts, and Judge Frank Johnson, one of those lonely federal judges down in the South who did the right thing, they adjudicated that they had a permit to continue the march. And he called George Wallace up to Washington. And we're going to talk about Wallace tomorrow. He put Wallace on the couch, and he had those deep cushions so that he would sink, you know. And I think it was Jim Rowe who called it the nostril inspection. And he looms over him, LBJ does. I am stealing from myself, I just realized. This is all tomorrow, so don't tell anybody. And Johnson says, George, let's not think about the next election for a minute. Let's not think about 1968. This is spring of 65. Let's not even think about 1988. Let's think about 2008. And do you want there to be a grave down there in Alabama, scrawny pine, stenciled on George Wallace he hated? Or do you want a glorious stone monument, gleaming, gleaming marble, that says George Wallace he built? It was an appeal to ego, but it was an appeal to do the right thing. It was a practical recognition, I would argue a patriotic recognition of what it takes to make people do the right thing. I don't care what your motive is. By your fruits we shall know them. And parenthetically, it's going to be if Vice President Harris prevails, it's going to be a fascinating period, because a lot of folks who have opposed the 45th president are going to have to decide, are they going to be like the father and the prodigal son? Or are you just going to celebrate when people come back and not worry about accountability? Or does there have to be some kind of explicit admission? I don't know, but I know it's going to be, if she wins, I think that's going to be a fascinating unfolding struggle within the Republican Party and what's left of the Republican Party. Thank you all very much. Thank you.